Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We are discussing vampires and the undead. Isn't this a European issue?
Certainly, we tend to think so, but it appears that the undead have made their way to North America and settled down, or up, or in, apparently quite happily here in the Ozarks.
We will get back to vampires, but first we want to invite you to like, follow, and subscribe to Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, as well as your favorite podcast platform. We also invite you to become a Dark Ozarks subscriber on Facebook. On the Dark Ozarks Facebook page, click subscribe, have your login information ready, and join Dark Ozarks behind the scenes for only $4.99 per month.
Your $4.99 per month subscription allows you to come with us on paranormal investigations, deep dive research, and topics too controversial for public view. The next 100 subscribers will be entered in a drawing for a free Dark Ozarks t-shirt and an exclusive signed first drawing copy of the book, Dark Ozarks, The Spook Light. Subscribe today to be entered in the drawing.
And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
We encourage you to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online, on Facebook, and at the website alwaysbuyingbooks.com for all of your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more. Not to mention, the building is haunted. Tell Bob and Elise we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and has been twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and great food in a historical building with a noir past. And yes, their building is also haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff that we sent you.
So, vampires in the Ozarks.
Not something that jumps to mind all the time, but
it is not.
There seems to be a reason for it.
And when you talk about it, as I've noted in just talking about the subject out and about, it definitely gets people's attention.
As you drop that in casual conversation.
Yes, as I do. And I do.
I know you do.
I'm not saying it was vampires, but it was vampires.
I think a lot of people associate the subject of vampires at this point as just a folkloric or fictional creation or plot device for movies and books. But it's a lot more than that.
It is. And certainly Bram Stoker with the Dracula novel is probably the turning stone for Western civilization and the modern era and our concepts of vampirism. And like any good scholarly Irishman would, he certainly employed his, at the time, late 19th century, due diligence in terms of doing research, particularly with the information that was, I would say, becoming more readily available about Eastern European folklore.
I agree. It was not just a fountain created out of his imagination.
No.
I think though it embedded the idea that this concept is a Eastern European concept, though.
Yes, it did. And what is very interesting, of course, Eastern Europe and Hungary, Romania, quite frankly, the Balkans have and northern Greece has its share, essentially the space of Eastern Europe sort of coming off the Adriatic has a really, really rich vampire lore and vampire history that I think that we would quickly recognize. And interestingly enough, the etymology, the word history of the word vampire, the meaning of the word vampire, is cloudy at best.
It is, and fraught with disagreement. I mean, you have the Eastern European Balkan tradition, whether that's where it comes from, and origin of word use. Actually, there are plausible arguments on the surface that go back to the Balkans, that also go back to medieval French, Slavic languages, and some even just hanging their hat on Middle English.
On Middle English, on Greek, Russian, German. It is obviously, if you do not do a deep dive into the word, you get some very simplistic answers. But the reality is that the etymology of the word vampire is complex at best. Sometimes the meanings associated can be complex, and I think that is appropriate, considering how oftentimes complicated or circuitous the information about the lore is itself.
And I think it's important to note on this that we are so used to the word vampire and what the connotation is now for it, that you have to kind of peel back the layers, that actually the word vampire very reasonably may come from several different words back in time that had a different meaning, specifically the meaning for a witch.
Yes. And that is an interesting etymology, particularly in regards, pardon me, particularly in regards of watching, as in this case, sects or segments of pre-Christian culture begin to interact with the Greek Orthodox Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church. We see very similar things with Roman Catholicism beginning heavy interaction with Scandinavia in the Dark Ages, or late Dark Ages, and particularly early modern era. And it is an interesting point of comparison, because in many situations, the Scandinavian word from which we derive the word troll was more of a reference to magic and quote unquote witchcraft, and with the authoritarian bloc of of Roman Catholicism at that time being put in place, could be translated as essentially a smear campaign against anyone or any shamanistic magic working, and it began to conflate the old word troll, which had a much more nuanced meaning, with something that was dangerous and hideous, and then moving from there to the point that when you say the word troll, certainly you are not conjuring, I use that word on purpose, conjuring up images of traditional Viking shamanism, but instead a frightening, grotesque, hideous, essentially cave goblin.
Yes. And I do think that the fact that there's a subtle use of the terms to denigrate paganism, witchcraft, etc., shouldn't be forgotten, because in fact the tropes of vampires feed back to that: shape-shifting into bats and preternatural life, and even the idea of not being seen in a mirror. Those are all basically analogies for magic.
Yes, they are. They are. And It is complex. I think something that almost happens by de facto, even without us thinking about it, is strongly existing within that mental space, even as we're attempting to do analysis upon the lore. It's very hard for people to get out of, remove themselves from a mind space in which they've been inured. And you see that here, particularly in references to witchcraft, the lore itself. It is seen through that lens. It is seen through what is essentially going to struggle with my own contemporary word usage, but it is essentially Orwellian in nature, although it is happening hundreds of years before George Orwell, in the reality that we have large authoritarian structures that are managing a population.
Oh, yes, very much so. Manipulation of the masses through propaganda. I mean, in its basic form, it's a way of keeping a lid on society, so you don't have people rioting or mobs, etc., and upending the social structure.
And certainly they're playing oppositional advocate on this. There's certainly a case to be made that Roman Catholicism in its authoritarian structure, certainly aspects of rationalism and the Enlightenment in the modern era, in various aspects, large aspects of religious thought, have brought, or in some cases, order out of chaos, or in some cases, empire out of not empire. Take that for its pros and its cons. And in many cases, in terms we've noted with even just analysis of infrastructure developed in the Ozarks during the Golden Era, or the Gilded Era, the Golden post-Reconstruction of the Civil War, that had a lot of cons, a lot of economic hardship upon lower classes, a lot of terrible things happening. You also have to admit that it created the foundational infrastructure that we today utilize, take advantage of, don't even give a second thought about. And it has to be, from the larger context, historical context and social context, has to be taken into account. There were positives. There's dozens of bridges that I drive over every day that wouldn't be there had that infrastructure not ultimately been put in place.
True. Progress is often 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and that is part of that process. And there's a lot of tools in that toolbox for that to happen. And over time, this is one of those. It is interesting. I also find it interesting that when you dig into the European concept of vampirism, you come back time and again to the idea of magic and witchcraft. And that's not unlike the concept of vampirism in other parts of the world, particularly in the New World.
It is. There's jumping directly into New World vampirism. Some of the certainly for me, one of the beings that really jumps out is the Sokiant. And the Sokiant comes from Caribbean folklore. It's closely associated with Trinidad and Tobago. And It's very easy to explain. It's a buhag.
But then you have to explain a buhag.
And a buhag directly ties to low country culture, specifically in South Carolina and northern coastal Georgia. We're looking at roughly Charleston to Savannah, roughly speaking. And it certainly brings up interesting questions. We are seeing potential of lore conflation or lore hybridization, but it's not European lore. If there are folkloric traditions that are being interchanged and developed, it would be between the Caribbean and West Africa.
Yes. I mean, I have read some articles that argue that in the midst of this is European vampirism lore being inserted into the West African lore, but I think that's more tenuous of an argument. I
tend to agree. I really do. And so the Sukiant is a witch. Now, what I do find particularly interesting, and perhaps there is a stronger West African connection with this, but the West Indies and the Caribbean lore, to me, shows a great deal of comparison with a Cherokee lore in terms of what is a witch, because we there, of course, with and what does this have to do with vampirism? Sukiants drain the life essence and energy from a person.
Yes.
They feed upon you.
Akin to a succubus or an incubus.
Yes. And interestingly, in this case, tend to do so forcibly and largely non-sexually, moving away from, and I think potentially moving away from that the imposed anxieties of Western Europe in regards to sexuality. I think that it's in the case of the Sukiant, she's draining you dry of your life, and there might be a sexual component, but if there is, that isn't a point of anxiety. The point of anxiety is that you'll end up dead ultimately. And again, there's a strong comparison. You could make the case for a strong conceptual link between Cherokee witches and Caribbean witches, if you're specifically talking about the Sukiant, and if you're specifically talking about black magic witches in the Cherokee, which I find really fascinating. And the key point on this is that the Sukiant appears as an old woman, but she isn't human. Right. And
never was.
And that is the direct implication. In short, the basic lore for the Sukiant is that she, and we use the term very loosely in this case, waits until nightfall, removes her skin, places her skin in a mortar, think mortar and pestle, puts it in there, and becomes a shivering ball of fire or shivering ball of light that can be seen flying about at night, reminiscent of, really strongly reminiscent of St. Elmo's fire in that regard. But the earth lights. Or earth lights. And the Sukiant can go into tiny spaces to get in and feed upon your life essence. interestingly enough, you could argue that the life essence being your chi, the Taoist concept, that not only do we have a physical body, but that what really matters is our energy, our life giving and life sharing energy. And that energy is spiritual in nature. It is physical in the sense that it exists. We each have an energy field, is obviously the concept. And basically speaking, we even with comparatively blunt diagnostic instruments, we understand that is true. But if we're in the tradition of the Taoist tradition, it is vastly more complex and beautiful and delicate in nature than that. And our concepts that have made it into mainstream, the concepts of things like Tai Chi, the concepts of things like one's chakras from an Ayurvedic perspective, that and yoga practice all have to do with this complex inner working of our energy. And that appears to be very alluring to the Sokyant, and it feeds on this energy. Now, the references with the Buhag in South Carolina, the idea, there is I think a more direct comparison with some Western European incubi, succubi lore, and the idea that that you are more aware, that you're aware that when you get up the next day and you're super tired, like you slept, but you're super tired, you're super drained, then the idea that the Buhag has been there.
Yeah. And I mean, there really is a parallel between this lore and the Eastern European concept of vampirism, draining blood. It risks your life, it risks your health, and you can become vulnerable physically, mentally, emotionally.
Yes, and I think that there's certainly an important commonality is the idea of community or group anxiety based upon that vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. Well, that almost is catching, and that kind of lends itself to another aspect of the European lore that we don't focus on as much now, because the motifs are Dracula.
Yes.
But is that vampirism and ghosts are intertwined.
Correct. Correct. And
particularly revenants.
Yes. And this idea, pardon me, this idea that you have almost a crossover. And I think part of that anxiety definitely is translated, interestingly enough, into mid to late 20th century zombie pop culture.
Yes.
The undead rising, because pop culture has really made an interesting turn, largely thanks to Bela Lugosi, in the idea of this and a shift, and and Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing and the Hammer horror films of the vampire, specifically Count Dracula, but we just say the vampire as a whole, being frightening but very alluring, very attractive, very seductive. And it's also fair to say that got leveraged up a notch with Anne Rice, considering the fact that whether she initially agreed with the casting or not, we end up with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise playing vampires.
Yeah.
And that and then of course continues however you feel about it, continues on with Twilight. But the concept, the Eastern European concept of the Revenant, is much more akin to what we would think of as zombies crawling out of graves.
Yes, zombies, but technically zombies that would then be ghosts.
Yes.
Time. And that's something that we don't focus on too much in a lot of lore in Western Europe, but that those can coexist. We tend to keep our ghosts in one pile and our zombies in another, but Eastern Europe, they can be one and the same, basically.
Well, and that's something that's very important for us to contemplate. And as we study lore, and you see this with Irish lore, you certainly see it with First Nation people's lore here in North America, that one thing isn't always that thing.
Yeah.
Something can be many things. And it's moving into that modality of not only supernatural, but also shifter, in the sense that it changes shape and changes substance. This is and for the record, it's has made its way into pop culture tropes, particularly the idea that Dracula transforms himself into a bat. So technically he is a shapeshifter, but our modern mindset, removed from traditional or ancient lore, can look at that and say, oh, that's spooky, or that's fun, or that's silly, or that's many things, but that's ultimately preposterous. And yet you dig into the lore, and the shifter lore that exists says it's not.
Right.
The concept of shape-shifting has very long been associated with dark arts.
Very much so. Very much so. Now, another interesting thing is that when we usually think of ghosts and revenants, it's something ephemeral. It's something, the typical paranormal question of it's not real because I can't touch it kind of thing. Now, an interesting point is that there's a long history of a much more tangible connection to, quote, vampires, which I think has affected the lore and just the unconscious concept of how we address it. And we don't think about that in 21st century times, but they would, hundreds of years ago, doctors would dissect, quote, vampires.
They would. And essentially the reality that there is a forensic pathology of European vampires. And it is very well documented from Eastern Europe by then rational academics.
Yes, and discussed by everyone from Rousseau to doctors to biologists, etc., on a very empirical level, not just lore.
And I think it's realistic to think that to draw connections that, for whatever reason, I suspect a complex milieu of social and historical reasons coming together, that this particular suspected phenomena was as well documented as it was, making its way into ultimately into the German language at a point where that information could be disseminated to a larger world in the particular Forensic Pathology and the Vampire by Paul Barber article that we're referencing, there's an extraordinary list on beginning on page 4. I do have to check on my puppy real quick, but if you just go through, share the basis of this, and I'll be back in just a second.
Okay. They're basically a compilation of the body of work covering the pathology, the actual forensic study of suspected vampires over time is very interesting. And these would be situations where graves or recently deceased were thought to be vampires, and then they were examined for whatever characteristics made them different than other corpses. And it gets rather interesting because they would view basically a vampire and a revenant almost interchangeably. Murder victims, suicides, and victims of plague would tend to be revenants. And indeed, revenants could cause plague. And of course, that made sense because the Black Death could be passed from corpses to the living. But interestingly, they often were unpopular people even before they passed away. That was a sort of almost an added thing. You were more likely to be considered a vampire or revenant if you were not popular to begin with, and either were murdered, committed suicide, or had the plague. The earth is disturbed at the revenant's grave, or there are holes in the earth. Basically, a grave that appears that perhaps the corpse has crawled out of and maybe crawled back into. Often it's noted that the body had not decomposed in a normal fashion, that it's bloated, flush, and incorrupt as it was buried, or appears to be swollen and black, having undergone some sort of change, and this would create the suspicion of vampirism. But again, mainly it's the fact that decomposition was not happening at the normal rate and speed as normally would be observed. Again, that they may suck blood from victims, which they would take the bloating of the body and blood around the lips when they're found in the grave as evidence of blood sucking, which of course has grown into probably the biggest trope of vampirism.
I agree.
Friends and neighbors of the revenant often die quickly after his death. They can be heard in the grave chewing on their extremities or on the shroud, especially in times of plague. They are most likely to be about in the winter, which I find interesting.
I do too.
The body is warm to touch, has an evil smell. Well, I think that one's fairly obvious. No signs of rigor mortis. Nails and hair have continued to grow after death. And his natural enemies are wolves and dogs. And they cannot cross water and must return to their grave by sunrise. So, I mean, a lot of these tropes are what we expect to hear in vampire stories even today.
It is. It really is. And as a point of debunking analysis, pretty much all of those points can be explained,
yes,
by very rational and non-supernatural causes, and it largely well, I'm going to take the I'm going to be Scully for a moment. Taking the is that there is a larger perspective, and certainly this is a perspective that is in alignment with the larger Greek Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, or Roman Catholicism at the time, which is, and by more urban thought at the time, which is those heathen peasants have no idea what they're doing, and
Yes.
and they're in many cases, as we look at this, they're being exposed to very understandable phenomena that's essentially can be summed up with individuals, particularly individuals who have been hastily buried, whether for the reasons of their death, for the reasons of their death across the board, but whether they're considered bad because of a suicide, or because they're a murder victim, or because they're a murderer, or because they died of the plague, that they're being hastily buried. The idea that those closely associated with the corpse die shortly thereafter. If you're talking about a plague victim, there's a very real possibility that they've contracted the plague as well. Those types of things,
or whatever contagious disease might be the cause.
Yes, that you're in dealing with shallow graves. You're dealing with wolves and dogs digging up shallow graves. You are dealing with the anxieties and the intensity of emotions associated with grief. You are dealing with the social tensions that are associated with, for example, a murder in the village, or a suicide in the village, and all of the resultant community sort of psychosocial issues that are part and parcel with that, and are to this day. I mean, we all deal with these things. If there's a tragedy within our midst, we all have to deal with it in some way.
Right.
And with the realities of bodily decomposition, which are different. I mean, it's difficult for us to associate and wrap our heads around that oftentimes because of our closeness to the material.
That plus our removal from it these days, because we don't typically observe decomposition. And that's one of those things that one sign is that that there are signs of rigor mortis, which we think of as death, and of course with embalming you have rigidity, but naturally rigor mortis is a temporary condition that only lasts a couple of days, and so a body that had been buried for a while would not be rigid.
No.
Same way with the concept of the vampire can't cross water. If you have a bloated body, it will float, and the idea is that it has an abnormal reaction to water, which again also correlates with lore with witchcraft too.
It does. The idea that that water itself is spatting out the evil. That is
that the witch will float. So if you had a trial by dunking in a witchcraft trial, and you sank and drowned, you were absolved because you were innocent. But if you didn't sink, they were going to kill you. So
yeah, that's what we like to call a no-win scenario.
Pretty much. or a certain win for the prosecution.
I now introduce you.
Oh, go ahead.
I now introduce you to the ghost and witch of Kobayashi Maru.
So let me fix my own rules. I do find it interesting that the methods for killing a reverend, and again, these are things that came out hundreds of years ago as far as beliefs, and they seem very familiar. To pierce him with a stake.
Mm-hmm.
In different areas, they would specify a different type of wood, or sometimes a needle would be specified, or to cut off his head, or cut out his heart, or burn the corpse, or all of the above.
I particularly liked, in this case, the outline list that is beneath number 16. A revenant can be killed by the following means. A, and it just reminds me, it's like a multiple choice test.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine if you're studying in your third year as a vampire hunter. A revenant may be killed in the following means. A, pierce with a stake. B, cut off his head. C, cut out his heart. D, burn him. Or E, all of the above. And of course, the answer is E.
E. Yep. More ways, the better. And again, another one that he could be kept in the grave by pinning him to the coffin or to the ground, by bolts, by stakes, or weighing down the body with stone, which of course leads to the wooden stake being used all the time in fiction.
And the idea of controlling a revenant by quote unquote harnessing their compulsions, scattering poppy or millet seeds or mustard seeds in the grave, which they then must gather up one by one, or putting a fishing net or sock into the grave with them, which they must unravel, usually at the rate of 1 knot per year. So taking advantage of their obsessive compulsive disorder and giving them something to do in the grave, which has a fae component. We see this with a number of European fae bits of lore. The idea that corporeal / non-corporeal evil fae have at times an issue with having to stop and count things. And so, and it could be a wide variety of things. It might be buttons, it might be rice, it might be, in this case, poppy seeds or mustard seeds. And it doesn't really seem to matter necessarily what the, as Mitch Hedberg noted, rice is a wonderful thing to eat when you want 10,000 of something. That it doesn't. It isn't. It's interesting because in the lore it doesn't seem to be so much hinged upon the type of thing, in the idea that you could only use rice, or you could only use, because we see a lot of, particularly in herbal lore, very specific types of flowers or roots or herbs being the thing that you're using to protect yourself. In this case, it's the idea that it just needs to be something that's small and there's a lot of it.
Yeah. And so, but again, by conjuring images of the fae, again, there's allusion to magic.
There is. There is. And just jumping back to some of the more unpleasant aspects of bodily decomposition. Some of the vampiric and revenant lore seems to be largely associated with some of the grotesquerie or the horrifying aspects of what happens if you were to go dig up a corpse? And
Right. Yes, particularly one that is taking its time to decay, which again goes back to you're more likely to see them in winter because the decomposition takes longer in the cold.
And there is a little bit of what I would classify as I don't usually use the term primitivism, because oftentimes when we're talking about particularly rural and folkloric people's beliefs, we are dealing with some very age-old customs that have strong ties to complex cosmological beliefs. But in some cases we don't, and human beings are messy things before and after decomposition, and complex messy things. Going to be my biography. But this larger idea that only the revenants and the vampires, those suspected of that, show signs of these horrible, grotesque, partial decomposition signs. Okay, but the ones that you suspect of vampirism are the only ones that you're digging up.
Right. And
it becomes
again,
very self-fulfilling.
It is, and of course, earlier we mentioned one of those signs was a disturbed grave or holes around it, which of course very well could be from animals trying to get to the body or anything else. So it's happenstance. Either they're unpopular to begin with, and so we suspect that they're revenant and rising in the night, or the grave's disturbed, probably from wolves or dogs, and so we go investigate, and guess what? We find these signs. And some of them are pretty interesting as far as the things that they would find. Of course, they would then stake them or pierce them with needles, and they would say sometimes flames would shoot out of the mouths of Slavic vampires, which again is probably related to you have a bloated body, and you then puncture it.
In the presence of lighted candles or lanterns.
Yeah.
Which, for the record, if you're an incredibly paranoid 14th century villager who's hunting for vampires in the dark of night, and your suspected vampiric corpse suddenly starts shooting flame 2 or 3 feet into the air, that's enough to make a believer out of you.
Probably. It's certainly going to leave an image, in your mind that's going to get repeated. Another one is that if he is killed in his grave, he's apt to scream or groan and to move suddenly, and fresh blood flows from his wounds. Again, that would be a natural consequence of a corpse.
Yes.
Now, interestingly, you may protect yourself from a revenant by means of garlic, which of course is still lore for vampires.
Yes, it is.
But it's been reasoned that it may have started out as a means of covering the stench of you opening up this grave.
It's not included in this article, but something that's really interesting. During the late 1340s, during the plague years, something that was documented was that continental European monks experienced a much higher than everyone else survival rate during the plague. And in later analysis, what they found was that the monastic monks ate a diet that was incredibly high in garlic. And garlic is an immune supporter. It's or immune stimulant in some cases. that it drastically improves the immune system. And so there seems to be certainly the possibility of that post 1340s association of garlic as magic.
Very much so, and effective to the point that it's remained in lore long after any reason for it is past. Let's see. Just kind of going through here. Again, you're looking at inadequacy of the burial. I found one thing interesting is that they would, as a means of detecting a vampire, they would attempt to lead a horse across the grave. If the horse balked, then it contained a vampire. But again, if it's loose soil and you're talking probably just days after it being of a burial, horses often will balk at walking on loose soil, and then it may also be because of the smell.
It could be because of the smell. Something that I'm going to interject on this is horses, like dogs, and do seem to be able to see into realms that we, the human beings, often cannot. Essentially, the idea of seeing through the veil.
Yes.
And so, while I do very much subscribe to the idea that, in most cases, leading your horse around a freshly dug up graveyard is probably going to make him balk and shiver at various locations, and you don't want to give in too much to your innate superstition. There are a number of cases in which horses seem to sense and see things that human beings cannot.
Very true. If you're around horses, you find that to be true. I find another interesting thing that they would look at is that they would hear noises in the grave.
Yes.
Which could be associated with the decomposition process, particularly rupturing.
Yes.
But again, I think it goes back to, we already suspect this person, so we're out here watching the grave, and we don't hear this happening with the other 10 graves that we aren't paying attention to and are not standing guard at.
Yes, and especially with the idea that these are graves that are much more hastily dug, that there's not the sort of long-standing or loving funereal customs that would be associated with a more popular person's death.
Well, and that it's just not buried as deeply, so you're more likely to hear those noises than a deeper grave.
Interesting comparison point, but ages ago now, my mom and I ended up burying a very large catfish. We always fed our catfish, and they became quite friendly. And so it was not uncommon to have 20-some pound catfish in the pond, which, for the record, was also the pond we swam in. But this particular big catfish had expired, presumably of old age, and it was big, quite big, probably over 20 pounds. Get washed up, and we're like, we got to do something about this. So we go and get it. It's a night not unlike this, late summer dusk, and frogs singing away. We're busy digging a grave for the giant catfish, and the catfish corpse is lying in the grass, and it begins making noises. odd cooing noises. And my mom and I are looking at each other like, yeah, like that's not interesting. We found it quite hysterical, actually. We were like, well, let's put him to bed before he has anything else to say. But at the same time, if you weren't expecting it or didn't realize that the gases bubbling up in the corpse are going to make noises when they come out, that it could be very unsettling, particularly if you're really gripped with anxiety and fear
already.
Already, yes.
Well, and a related item is that they would report that the revenant or the vampire would sit up in its grave or in the coffin. And again, that is a part of the decomposition process. And ironically, I have a story on this, that it's not necessarily limited to, hundreds of years ago when they didn't embalm bodies and so forth. When I was in college, someone that I knew actually had lived in an apartment in a funeral home. And so in exchange for the room and board, they basically kind of watched over the place at night, which was a good deal for a college student. But he would tell the story that he had to be careful when he woke up in the middle of the night and wanted to go down the kitchen and get a snack, because to walk downstairs and to the kitchen, he would have to walk through the rooms where the corpses were lying. And it would not be unusual to walk in and a corpse would be sitting up. And he even had a couple of times that one would sit up while he was walking through the room and kind of startle him. So these are still first world problems.
Yes, and without a doubt, while there is, of course, very rational explanations for these things, that's damned unsettling. That's nightmare fodder right there.
It would, I have to admit, not a whole lot gets to me, but I'm not sure I would. I would want to do that day in and day out.
No.
I can be pretty cheap and cost conscious, for rent, but
I can too.
That might be my limit. I don't know, even for me. So
it's quite possible in that regard. Yeah.
It didn't seem to bother him any, but it's like, yeah, okay.
I'd be upstairs going, exactly how bad do I need a bologna sandwich right now?
Exactly. It might be a good way to diet. I don't know.
Yeah. Something that I thought was really interesting in this article is the reference. It's on page 11 of the article itself. Among some gypsies, it is believed that a simple curse is sufficient to destroy a troublesome vampire. In one Romanian gypsy folktale, for example, a vampire is quickly destroyed by saying to him, "God send you burst." On hearing this, the vampire was so enraged that he literally burst, leaving nothing but a large pool of blood where he had stood. And the thrust of the article is essentially exposure to bodies that are bloated or bloating.
Uh-huh.
But I do find it interesting. We see a pattern, and I'm curious as to your thoughts on this. Certainly with Roman imperialism, we saw this pattern with the Etruscans, which were the rural peasantry, and likely a rural peasantry that had a complex cosmology relating to everything from stuff like the duende, the Mediterranean region fairies, to protection of the evil eye, things that we still see in practice, particularly in Sicily, and then in Sicilian immigrants, to, of course, in this case, the sort of the high church and the Enlightenment, making reference to Romanian gypsy lore and the idea that the gypsies know what's going on. They have ways, they have means. You also go over to Ireland and you look at, for example, Lady Grey and her work and writing with the Irish peasantry, which weren't the peasants before James and later Cromwell. That you have sort of this idea that the indigenous people whom you are subjugating have an idea or an in or a know. They have special knowledge that is associated with the dark, that's associated with, it's almost a peasant Gnosticism of sorts, or a peasant occultism.
I think you have it right there. It is a peasantry occultism in the traditional sense of the word, hidden knowledge, secret knowledge, that they know things that, the urbane aristocratic society do not. And you see that motif not only in Europe, but think of in Caribbean lore, and in the South, particularly in the American South, with hoodoo and voodoo. It's the same kind of structure, that the peasantry or those without means actually have more power when it comes to the ethereal world than those with all the money in the world.
Yes, and it is a really it's almost not almost, I mean, it becomes a trope, but it is also self-fulfilling in many ways. And and I think that I'm going to jump back into the Ozarks for a moment. I think that there's a certain amount of this concept as tourism and modernism made their way into the Ozarks, and you look at that modernism as opposed to, for example, granny woman traditions. That and there is it is a natural, I suspect, a natural outcome of these types of socially structured hierarchies, and also the questions of modernism versus, in this case, rural populations. And you could even argue that there is sort of a sense of three strata. You have the upper authoritarian, quote unquote, elite, your modernists, your individuals with the technology, with the analysis tools, with the essentially holy book of scripture. And that could be the Bible, but it doesn't have to be. It could be any larger thought process that says we are moving ourselves progressively forward into the modern era. And then you seem to have essentially the quote unquote uneducated but non-occult peasantry that are oftentimes anxiety ridden, questioning things, moved to mob action, moved to in some cases the idea that they're minimally literate, that they are prone to very simplistic thought processes, that they're afraid of the powers that that are being imposed on them, and those powers might come from an authoritarian source, but they also might come from nature. They might come from the dark. The idea that you are a victim to the vagaries of all these things around you. And then beneath that, or adjacent to that, you have a much smaller minority of that peasant occult practitioner, the individuals who, in many cases, have no concern or no respect whatsoever for this larger authoritarian monolith, and at the same time are not typically, the concept is that they're not in the trope, but also I think it's a trope that's filled out. They are not gripped with fear like the quote unquote common villager, because they certainly within their societal structure, they know what's going on. They have the secret knowledge. They understand what these things are, and they're not typically afraid. Or if there is something to be afraid of in some way, they understand what it is, and so they are able to maneuver around it or ward against it.
Yes, and by doing so, they're able to either be a champion for the other segments or their foe. And
Yeah.
that duality and that question of what side are you on creates a tension with those other segments of the population.
It does. There is the creation of tension with the what I'm going just within the constraints of this episode and conversation. I'm going to refer to as the non-occult peasantry. The non-occult peasantry both understand, and interestingly enough, we don't see, certainly in a lot of the past, we don't see documentation or interviews with the occult peasantry. And I think for obvious reasons. They are guarded, often solitary or comparatively solitary, and not people want to be talking to the monolithic overarching authorities. But
well, and aside from that, you don't want to, they don't want to give away that hidden knowledge that does give them leverage in society.
100%. It's because there is a great deal of power in that, typically utilized for self-preservation.
Mm-hmm.
The idea and the sense that the non-occult peasantry could turn on them at any point, and the monolithic authoritarian structure would be happy to just eliminate them because they don't believe that they should be practicing.
That, or often it's also that monolithic authoritarian structure that is going in the back door and buying their services.
Mm-hmm. Yes, particularly in the case of hoodoo.
Yes, hoodoo and voodoo both, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's really an incredible testament to hoodoo, and an incredible testament to voodoo and I would argue a testament to the efficacy of the traditions, and everyone else can parse out what I mean by that. The efficacy of the traditions that these very complex cosmological belief structures and practices have continued to this day. You don't, to put a fine point on that, you don't practice those sorts of things as a non-working hobby, and you don't carry it from generation to generation just for the fun of it. I think that it is fair to say that many folk traditions rise up and then die out because, quite frankly, they don't have efficacy, but some do.
Right, because particularly people on the margins, don't have the luxury of time and resources to devote to things that don't benefit.
No, they don't. And I would, we have this approximate delineation of social structures, and it's very approximate. We're painting in a very broad brush in this regard, but the authoritarian monolith structure, the non-occult peasantry, and then what I would classify, I think it would be fair in most cases to classify as a rural occult minority. And it was very enlightening to me to realize, because we often associate, going back a long time, we often associate this as an argument of Christianity versus paganism.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very enlightening to me. I was perusing a book by Raven Grimassi, who I'm not saying yay or nay on his work. He's since passed. I do have several of his works. But my biggest takeaway that I found really interesting and worthy of note was that there appears to be a dynamic that occurred as the Roman Republic became the Roman Empire. And as that happened in modern day Italy, the Roman Empire had its state sanctioned religion, which obviously was not Christianity. We simply, and it is such today, from a post-classical perspective, that we think of the Roman religion, which was a very real functioning religion with a complex cosmological structure. We simply think, we don't think of it in terms of a religion, we think of it in terms of classical mythology.
Right, because we tend not to look outside the snow globe that we sit in.
No, but we also don't, and I find this really interesting in terms of oftentimes not taking ourselves out of the snow globe, that we don't think of, if we think of Roman mythology or Greco-Roman mythology as paganism, it is still, for lack of a better word, it's classy paganism. It's
dressed up.
Yeah, it's the great mythos, the great mythologies of an empire, vastly different than the images that we're still inured with the idea of the witches of Northern Europe, or the trolls, or the elf kings, or these types of things that we think of as really Germanic, Scandinavian, and Celtic, and well, Anglo-Saxon would also technically be Germanic folklores. This sort of fires on the moor and dark things happening in the caves and this sort of thing. It's very, very different than these, the grand, sculptures. Yes, exactly. But it is, and so all that to be said, coming back to the rise of the Roman Empire, that there was conflict between the urbanization and the authoritarian empire and its cosmology, its quote unquote pagan religion, and the beliefs of the quote unquote primitive country people who did not dramatically associate themselves with the Roman pantheon in its iteration at that time, and that there was, and this is the argument that Grimassi makes in his books, that there was a conflict between the official state religion and its authoritarian structure, and the cosmologies of the folk people, the cosmologies of the rural people, who, in the case of Italy, were predominantly Etruscan, and that those people had these wild rural belief systems with a strong emphasis upon what we would recognize as fairies, a strong emphasis upon the hearth instead of the city square. And there is some arguments that aspects of Pan are actually a traditional forest Etruscan god that have been brought into, perhaps to appease, perhaps to essentially sublimate the belief structures, but always with this aspect of the monolithic authoritarian urban centers are looking down, but also possibly going to and using, protection from the evil eye and that sort of thing. And this odd tension. Now that is between what we would think of as a mythological or pagan belief system interacting with another quote unquote pagan belief system, completely completely devoid of quote unquote Christianity. And so I think it's important as we take ourselves out of the snow globe to realize it's not specifically the belief structure. It is human nature in varying kinds of groups and how they interact as they gain structure and authority, as opposed to a more lived experience.
Well, yeah, I mean, and to be honest, I mean, the process just continued as formal religion changed from Roman state religion to Christianity.
Yes.
And you just kept incorporating the, aspects of trying to subjugate the peasantry, gain allegiance. And so things tended to morph into something new, but they were all nuanced on these other layers that many people today don't recognize or would rather not think about as having contributed to and being a part of, quote, current religion.
I very much concur. And once you realize that the term state religion seems to be in effect, it doesn't really matter what the belief structure is associated with that. No. It is very helpful in terms of analysis, because in a postmodern secularism, state religion might still have the patina of Christianity, but it certainly doesn't have to, but it still functions the same way. Right.
I mean, and for to be honest, I mean, that can apply to very modern notions of paganism, of Wicca, etc., that are recognized as religion, but it still has that same nuanced layers and background. Another way to look at it is from theosophy. That the notion that all of these ideas go back to a proto-root belief system that was prevalent throughout the Indo-European language groups, thousands of years ago, and that the differences in different parts of the world, say from the subcontinent to Europe to the Middle East, etc., are basically the process of that proto belief system being passed down through all of these generations, and the local nuances that got added, basically.
At the end of the day, I just want to go find Atlantis.
Well, you're like it'll be at the bottom of the abyss or something. So.
Maybe I don't want to find it that bad.
Exactly, or wait for better submersibles.
That much better. At the end of the day, you had me at Indo-European.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Now, going back directly to vampires, people might be surprised that we've had our own sort of waves of vampire hysteria in North America.
Yes.
And beginning in of all places, stayed in reserved New England, which I think in some ways seems the most unlikely place to have a vampire craze.
And it really does. But then again, perhaps not.
True. And go ahead.
And interesting, the one thing that you cannot avoid when you're talking about vampires is psychosocial community anxiety.
Yes, I mean, even more so than other sort of preternatural worries, you don't seem to have that same response, even with things like werewolves, or which were taken very seriously for much of history as well, or ghosts, or I think the only thing akin to it, honestly, is in the last 50 years with the idea of demonic possession, it comes the closest.
Yeah, and the closest historical follow-up is witches. You have the idea that you have the grave of a vampire, you have the grave of a witch, and that there is some sort of powerful totem that is associated with both.
Very true, but again, psychosomatically, that may go back to the fact that the intertwining of witchcraft and magic and vampires throughout history, even if we are not conscious of that.
And I suspect that it does. There's and we're dealing predominantly with Rhode Island, and the fact that there are three women accused of being vampires: Mercy Brown, Sarah Tillinghast, and Nellie Vaughn. Both Mercy Brown and Sarah Tillinghast were accused of being vampires in their day. Nellie Vaughn's vampire status is really interesting because it occurred over time. It occurred, and this is a social commentary that all documentation is that Nellie had nothing associated with vampirism or the occult whatsoever in her life, but over time, in the decades following her death in 1889, that she was turned into a vampire, not literally, but in terms of cultural belief, which is both very fascinating and also really tragic, in the sense that she herself might have been deeply distraught over that, and it seems to be that there's a bit of conflation with her grave with the other women, so it's not in the same cemetery.
Right. I think they're actually in 3 separate cemeteries, if I remember correctly.
Now Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
One thing that might have contributed just to Nellie's story. She died of pneumonia in 1889 and was buried in the grounds of her family farm. But at the request of her mother, her body was unearthed and reburied in the town cemetery, where it remains to this day. And so certainly the possibility of mistaken identity, possibly with Mercy Brown, but perhaps that long-standing reminder that this was somebody who was dug up and reburied.
True, but you know that happens, and nothing happened enough in the past that you would think that if that was sort of the subconscious reason of associating it, we would have more of those stories.
You would, because that wasn't terribly, and still isn't terribly unusual.
No, and so it really just does seem awfully odd. And it's really interesting. Another thing that I find really interesting is, as you said, the social anxiety around this subject, that there seems to end up being this almost mob mentality, even if they're not a physical mob, of having to do something. And so you have a pattern of vandalism of graves and tombstones, and that really doesn't seem to serve any purpose other than perhaps a release of anxiety.
And I think that it's anytime that you have comparatively large groups of people feeling compelled to do a thing and perhaps being unable to explain exactly why that they are compelled to do a thing, it's worthy of note in terms of the larger community situation. Mm-hmm. Something that is worthy of reference, and this really reminds me of many of our reported or purported witch graves in the Ozarks, is that the epitaph on Nellie Vaughn's grave is, quote, "I am waiting and watching for you." And the reference, of course, is the rather idyllic actual meaning from the 1880s and the 1890s, that she is at peace and at rest, ostensibly in heaven, and is waiting and watching for her loved ones and for her family. Something that is meant to bring a sense of peace or a sense of calm. And then over the years, that has been retranslated in a very ominous way.
And perhaps it just means that we're more paranoid now than they were then. I'm not sure.
I think so. Messy, complex things.
Yes, but you know, this whole concept of doing something to the graves and desecrating them, vandalizing things, it brings up a little larger topic that applies to a lot of things that we talk about in Dark Ozarks, and that's, you know, the colloquial folklorist term legend tripping.
Yes.
And legend tripping is basically when people they actually go out purposely to a place where something odd or unusual is believed to have happened, in an interest in testing that legend. And that happens with witch graves, in Rhode Island with the vampire graves. In the Ozarks, you see it actually in quite a few places. Well, the Spook Light is one. People trying to find the albino farm, which it's no secret where it is. It just isn't an albino farm. Zombie Road and different places. There is a very rich and ongoing tradition of legend tripping in the Ozarks.
It is, and something, you know, in terms of attempting to trip the legend or do an activity to see if the purported thing that is to happen will happen.
Mhm.
Is extremely varied, especially in terms of its complexity. I mean, there's a wide range. On the soft end, something as simple as just being in the space at the right time, at the rumored time, such as nightfall, going and interestingly enough, we as investigators peripherally do this all the time.
Yeah.
Place ourselves within the space to see if the reported phenomena occurs.
I mean, technically, you can say paranormal investigations or cryptid investigations, etc., are by definition legend tripping. Mhm.
Yes, and then ramping it up, and I think we'll get into this, tonight, in the death by folklore portion of our episode, but moving into the area of, for example, the reported haunted house or the reported witch's grave, and taking a Ouija board there, or in some cases, the attempting to reenact or fake an occult ritual at someone's grave, and these types of, like, there's a steep hill of things that individuals do to attempt to touch the veil, really.
Yeah, and part of that is to test the legends, that curiosity, and part of it is, it kind of harkens back to the conversation about the occult peasantry of trying to touch that knowledge and trying to gain that knowledge for yourself because you don't already have it in a lot of cases.
And that's a very a very compelling aspect for many people. When I think it is perhaps its most irritating is when it's being undertaken through more without a clear understanding as to why the person is being compelled to do the thing that they are doing. This and it's it is something very, it is uniquely human. It is oftentimes very primal in its urges, even as something as primal as, I want to get scared, I want something spooky to happen. And what interestingly enough, I mean, I think it's a testament to our the folks that are along with us in Dark Ozarks, etc. But increasingly, the folks, and I'm going to reference the tour at the Web City Library on Saturday, that increasingly the majority of people are there. Yes, they have an interest in ghosts and the paranormal, as do we. They have oftentimes, as we saw, about half of the room was very stoked about history, but less and less of people coming into the space, into the quote unquote haunted space in which we're doing an investigation and a tour, and being super scared or super edgy. Still happens, but I was noticing a lot of people on Saturday night were very respectful, very interested, but not super jumpy.
That's true. I mean, when we first started, I did notice that there were some in the crowd that, as we were talking, that you could tell that they were a little titillated. They were that, bit of that nervousness. And I think as we talked, that tended to calm down. even more than you would see even just a few years ago. And maybe part of that is sort of, we talk about the normalization of the paranormal. And to a degree that is happening for the good points and bad points through reality TV shows, through a lot of YouTube channels and so on and so forth, that people feel like they have some knowledge or some reference, or they've seen enough to know they're not going to fall off the cliff, so to speak.
Yes. And probably the first quote unquote ghost tour that I ever went on, it was in the Ozarks. And it was an October tour, and it was involved in there were some kitschy props that were from, Lowe's or Menards or the Spirit World store, whatever. And they were fun. I mean, it made for a good photo op. It was a beautiful historic location. But the thing that I found interesting, particularly interesting in that process, was the tone of the guests. That was actually, I spent more time reading the people than I did looking for the ghost, because it was a pretty quiet night.
And some nights are.
Yes. And it's just part of it. And this was my approximate read for this particular tour. It was an urban tour, and the beginning was a lot of suburban couples, some of them on their date night. I think a number of them on their date night away from their kids. And it's coming up on Halloween, typically one or the other, but I think in most cases the wife or the girlfriend going, oh, let's go do something spooky, and then Mr. Management Golfer is being dragged along for the ride. And the initial
that describes our relationship, how we got you doing this.
Exactly. So although I don't golf,
minus the golf part, yes.
Yeah. The first experience, the first vibe, or the first tone that was going along was, oh, this is a joke.
Mm-hmm.
This is silly. This is a joke. This is for entertainment purposes only. What time does Applebee's close? Because I want a cheap drink. That kind of vibe. And then as the tour progressed, and say the first, I don't know, 20 minutes or so, where actual experiences were related about in engaging with the supernatural, the paranormal, that these things happening, you could feel the chill in the air, not from not from a cold spot, but from the unsettling idea that the world might not be exactly what they thought it was.
Yeah, I've watched that process before.
Mm-hmm. And then through the experience, transitioning to largely just a curiosity and interest. Is something going to happen? Is it not? What's going on? And then in the conclusion, which is why I'm not saying where it is, but there was the encouragement to download a ghost hunting app on the iPhone, which, if you understand that you're ghost hunting anyway, there's a lot of issues with that. But something that I saw happen that was dissipating, and perhaps unintentionally dissipating, was that initial emotional tenuousness, the idea that suddenly I'm not walking on even ground anymore because the world might not work the way that I think it does, is suddenly the ghost gets encapsulated into, an app
Yeah.
on your phone, and it might spew out a word, or it might beep, it might do something, and suddenly, and I for myself found this, actually this was the most frustrating or irritating aspect, was the conclusion, not for the tour because they were just doing what they were doing, but not the company, they were just conducting their stuff as they felt necessary, but for the people, because the people had started out skeptics, and then they had briefly touched with the uncomfortable idea of the veil, and of the potential of the passage through the veil, and the idea that there is a great deal more in the world around us. And it can be very unsettling. It can be very turn your head wrong side out. But by the end, all of those concerns gets encapsulated into an app that I've downloaded and I have control over. And I saw this within the group. It's one of the reasons I'm very glad that we leave our tours and our investigations so open-ended for people to have to introspectively ponder the aspect, because I think that's the most important thing. And what I saw was people filing out going, left without introspection. They had their ghost properly encapsulated in their pocket with an app that they probably deleted later.
That, or they really bought into the app, and of course it's junk.
Yes. And as just it's ridiculous on many levels, but the most obvious is that you are, among other things, hunting for an electromagnetic field surge using a piece of equipment that simply creates electromagnetic field surges.
Well, talk about a self-fulfilling prophecy.
They're everywhere.
Yep.
They're
You're guaranteed to find one that way. I agree. Now, of course, who knows, at our next tour, we may have all of that again, but it is interesting that people. What I find interesting is they come to events and explore these issues almost in spite of themselves, because many do have reservations or fears of some sort that they are, dealing with, as far as, I'm going to get my nerve up and go do this, even though I'm afraid that something spooky is going to happen. And you do see that. But they do, but definitely the last tour, they tended to rein that in, it seemed, and it played out well. It was a good tour, and I think people enjoyed it. So hopefully more of that.
I do have to check on Puppy real briefly, but let's jump into the vampires of Springfield and the mythology around that. But you can't really understand the vampires in the tunnels without understanding the tunnels in Jordan Creek. So if you share with people about Jordan Creek a little bit, and then I will be back in just a second.
Okay. And so when we talk about vampires of Springfield, it does go back a long ways. There are some indications that there was a sort of an organized vampire cult as far back as the 1890s. There's some reference to it, particularly for several prominent businessmen But you really get into the nature of vampires in Springfield, Missouri in the late 70s and 80s and 90s. And then it seems to have fallen off. And then I've seen surveys about it in recent years, and a lot of people not even knowing about it. But for that modern period, it centers around the tunnels under downtown Springfield. And as Josh said, that only makes sense if you understand the tunnels. A lot of downtown Springfield, which of course, if you traverse it now, it's basically a concrete jungle, all paved over in asphalt and concrete. However, there is a creek that runs through the downtown area, Jordan Creek, and it caused a lot of flooding over time. So in the 1930s, they took the action of basically boxing in the creek underground so that it wasn't dammed up, but it lowered the creek, and most of it is basically a three-sided concrete tunnel that it goes through. And in places it's covered, other places it is open between buildings and so forth. But for the most part, to look at it, you would think, oh, I'm looking into, say, a drainage ditch or something that was man-made entirely and not just to corral the creek. But it definitely was done for that purpose. Now, there are other tunnels adjacent to the creek and that run between buildings and so forth. And those are the tunnels that come into play when you talk about vampires in Springfield. So basically, I just got through that. So
Yes.
perfect timing.
I like the juxtaposition because in Springfield, you really, on the top side, you really don't get any indicator that all of this subterranean potential is there.
No, and most people would, drive by or walk by and don't have no idea where any of the, and where the creek is underground or where entrances to the tunnels are. But it's kind of one of those things, once you know, it's hard, you can't unsee it. It's pretty obvious.
It is.
And basically what happened is that, as in many underground spaces, whether it be caves or tunnels or quarries or whatever, people made use of those spaces for secret agendas, secret, activities, where you didn't want too many prying eyes. And one of those activities has been reputed since the 70s to be a vampire cult. And that they would meet in the tunnels. And in fact, there's a lot of tales that it's very organized, that they're basically chapels, that basically a vampire almost church with rituals, etc. And I heard the stories when I went to college in Springfield, and people exploring it. And we know people who have explored it and actually ran into people down there, got chased out.
Yes.
So a very almost territorial situation with it too. And so this was whispered through Springfield for a long time. And then it really kind of came to the forefront in the mid-90s with the Feeney murder trial.
It did. Something that is conceptually really fascinating to me with the Feeney murder trial is that you have the rumors of this underground cult
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, more than rumors. I mean, I think it's fair to say that a variety of people are or have utilized the tunnel system for a variety of things, objectively have done things down there. It's not, that aspect of it is not legend. That
No.
aspect of it is reality. What they're doing precisely is up for analysis, up for debate.
Right.
But the idea that there are people doing things in the space, that is a confirmed reality.
It is. And another aspect with the Feeney murder trial that I always found kind of fascinating, a point that people fixated on that to me was sort of like, okay, whatever, was the fact that John Feeney played Magic the Gathering, which is a role-playing game, card game. Has been around for a long time, kind of, you know, just like Dungeons and Dragons and many others. And it's a lot like a lot of this lore about vampires and so forth, that one seemingly random or not necessarily innocuous, but unrelated things ends up being used to point to something else. That the fact that he played this game in the public eye became proof of, oh yes, he's part of the vampire cult.
And there's a rich complexity of occult anxiety, nuance, all at work here. I think that it would be, of course, my introduction with Magic the Gathering was our intern who played Magic the Gathering all the time. I was constantly bragging about his card collection. I'm sure it's gotten bigger by now. And nothing, and I will say this, I think something that really helped disenchant, I mean this in the best possible way, disenchant or de-occult a lot of this stuff was actually Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings.
Well, this predates that, though.
Well, I know, but vastly. But right. So obviously it hadn't been demystified at that point. But I'm just talking about what I see as a positive trend.
Oh, okay.
A positive current trend that with Lord of the Rings becoming mainstream, it's really allowed for much more meaningful and nuanced conversations. Whereas before, if you were sitting in the corner talking about orcs and wizards and goblins, they're like, what are you, some sort of pagan Satanist? You're like, no, I just like Tolkien. Have you ever read it? And they're like, no. So that I think we're moving in a realm that there can be a lot less anxiety about that. And I think today, of course, this was in 1995. And so certainly a lot more space for anxiety about magic related role-playing games.
Yes. And to an extent, even then I got, it was like, okay, I get that. But the sort of the mob mentality that became, well, if he's doing that, he's got to be a part of the vampire cult.
Well, and it's that's tenuous logic at best.
It is, but it's, definitely, and of course it's that communal fear, because you had gruesome murders of his wife and children while he was at a conference, and the question was, did he somehow come back and kill his family and get back to the Lake of the Ozarks for his alibi? And this other aspect of it almost was, this sideshow carnival going on. But it showed this anxiety that we've talked about that goes through time with the subject of vampires in a very real-time, very modern sense, that it can still be very contagious for people.
Very easy to fall into.
Yes. And another thing that maybe today, because we're almost 30 years out, that people don't think about is, during this same time period, especially through the 80s and early 90s, you had large numbers of self-identified vampire communities in a lot of large cities in North America, particularly New York and New Orleans and Boston, that you would hear certain, stories about, and one in particular in New York, where an investigative reporter disappeared while investigating these groups. And so even if it wasn't a conscious connection, it does kind of make you wonder if just that societal anxiety about this possibility, for whatever, you had a zeitgeist of this coming together in this case, and it reignited the tales of the tunnels.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very fair potential analysis on the. What I find really interesting is that there's, I'm not alleging an actual connection, but I'm talking about the concept, the conceptual aspect of the case. This idea of something dark and occult, using the term occult in the popular vernacular, not in the technical, occurring in the underground. And I think that the Feeney case became a focusing point, almost like the point that the water comes out of the hose, or that of this psychosocial fear of the dark and of the underground, that suddenly there's a name and a face in a suburban above ground neighborhood in which this is being explored, psychosocially, and explored as a community from a psychological standpoint.
Very much so, especially at that time. And it didn't necessarily end there. I mean, there is a case from November of 2016 in Springfield again of a woman stabbing her boyfriend after a sharing blood relationship.
Yes, and something that is important to note is that there are very real vampire cults, in the sense that groups of people who, for a variety of reasons, act out either singular, individually, and then also in group, vampire-related actions. that it's, and that's not saying that vampires are real, but it is saying that people who are doing this very much are real. And there's a wide variety of complex human reasons for exploring those kind of ideas, tropes, and fetishes.
Agreed.
And
And-
some
and-
of it is just on the surface, just the idea of it's very dedicated Anne Rice cosplay.
Fair. And that does get played. That cosplay type of cosplay does get played up, but sometimes it can get out of hand, as in this case where we
Yes.
ended up with someone stabbed and someone arrested.
Yes.
And there are some other examples in the Ozarks that are kind of interesting. One of my favorite is the Albans vampire grave that's in Park Hills.
Yes, mining town in St. Francois County.
Yes, and that is a very old area. That's the original French mining area. And ironically, the subject of this legend was a miner who was Hungarian.
And the
Which
Hungarian
makes you wonder.
It does. And part of the lore says that he was also an albino.
Yes. And again, particularly when we get into legend tripping and then on into urban legends, you're getting potent combinations when you start throwing albinos in the mix, because they are so prevalent in those stories. But the lore around this is that the miner would never leave the house during the day. Children began mysteriously dying. People around him were dying. And he ultimately was murdered by local residents, and then the mysterious deaths ended. That's the lore.
Yes.
But it says he was buried in the cemetery surrounded by the graves of the children who had died, which I find very unlikely. If they really thought he was responsible, that would be the case, but maybe not. It says a cross-adorned fence was built around the grave to keep him in. But again, a lot of graves and small plots from that time period would have iron fences around them, and not meant to keep, reverence in or anything. So it does make you wonder if that's just a conflation that has come up over time.
And there are aspects of this story that do suggest that there is a conflation there, in the sense that you come upon things that appear somewhat out of the ordinary, and then lore begins to build up around it. That's not to say, particularly in a rough mining environment, that there might not have been an individual who was doing terrible things to children.
Exactly. Ironically, in the same cemetery, there's a tale of Civil War soldiers there, and one of those soldiers was Moses Milton, and there was a lore that possibly he was the vampire. But he died in 1904, ironically after drowning with suicidal intent, which again would make him more susceptible to being accused.
Yes.
But apparently the inquest just found that he drowned. But it is interesting that the lore in that area, which it's a very old area, French in nature, and a lot of vampire lore in Western Europe does go back to France. So, so it is kind of interesting that a French area has these two tales right there together, both with aspects of it that really kind of check off the list of pathology, making them more likely to be accused.
It does. It is an interesting point of comparison. Just jumping back to something we talked about, werewolf, just briefly. And of course, there's an interesting dichotomy and sort of implied relationship between vampires and werewolves. The historical background on this is that the individuals suspected of being werewolf or suspected of being vampires were buried in shallow graves, which made them susceptible to being dug up by canines, and that the dominant wild canine were wolves, in addition to wild packs of wild dogs. And that's a very mundane explanation, but I think it's in many cases probably the most accurate. And then there's underworld, but we have it something that you said really struck me, which is that we have rumored tales of vampire graves, we have rumored tales of witch graves, we have no rumors of werewolf graves.
That's true. I mean, even Dogman tales and hellhounds. I don't know of any tales of where a hellhound was buried, or any booger dog, anything like that of an actual grave. That is interesting.
And I'm curious about that. Of course, I mean, now that I said that, there'll probably be somebody who's like, "There's a werewolf grave." But just in terms of
I'd love to investigate that.
Yeah, just the overall tenor of the lore. You don't have werewolf graves. You don't go to the grave of a reported werewolf and do a thing because you don't know where they are. I'm assuming, like wild dogs, they just go off in the forest and die. They don't actually have graves.
Well, they keep changing back though, so they're. I guess maybe they just end up dying as a mortal man.
As human. So you just don't know. Could be.
That is an interesting possibility. I hadn't thought of that.
It is. That
you left me with a conundrum now.
Do what I can. Just realize it. I should put on American Werewolf in London and see how Sky feels about it. Sky does not like to get upset watching TV. I'm just going to throw this out here. And aside on my little ghost watching dog, he likes Little House on the Prairie. And he really likes the BBC documentary The Celts from 1987. He likes
but I know he watches Supernatural too, so.
But not a lot, and he gets anxious. That's I was watching Jupiter Ascending last night after volunteering, and he got very anxious over the combat scenes.
Okay.
And I know
you were so really tired.
I know that he gets anxious because he pees a lot when he gets anxious, even more than usual. So I'd like to watch American Werewolf in London because I really like that film, but I'm really not sure how my Basset Hound is going to respond to that medium.
I don't know what to say to that.
I think in conclusion for tonight's episode, I don't want to conclude the episode without talking about the Bill Ellis article, Death by Folklore, Ascension, Contemporary Legend, and Murder.
Yes.
And the article really centers around a double homicide in rural southeastern Ohio in 1980. And as far as Dark Ozarks coverage goes, the information, the overall tenor, the overall psychosocial community culture, the overall situation rings true for many things that have happened in the Ozarks as well.
Yeah. Oh,
So
yeah. It's definitely not isolated to Ohio.
No, and it hits close to home, and it's a really tragic situation in which two teenagers, Annette Cooper and Todd Schultz, were murdered, and they were gruesomely dismembered as well. And the result, the situation that came out of that is really a complex study in terms of how a community responds to this situation. And I think what we're seeing is the natural phases of response of a quote unquote non-occult peasantry.
I think that's an astute observation. I think that is very, very true, and you see that as an analog in a lot of these situations that don't necessarily involve murders, but in just dealing with these subjects of myth and the supernatural.
And we see a close mirror with the vampire lore, specifically the fear of vampires within a space, or a vampire's cult within the space. And as is is it to certainly something, our tagline for Dark Ozarks is sometimes there are no easy answers. Here is a perfect example that there just aren't easy answers. I'm going to jump back to an earlier point I was getting ready to make and then got distracted by goblins with the Feeney case, and making a point of comparison with the long list of things that could make you a vampire, most of which are simply things that happen to a decomposing corpse. The idea of, oh my goodness, name one of them. The horse shied away from the grave. Must be a vampire. And in the case of the Feeney trial, oh my goodness, he was playing Magic the Gathering. He must be in the occult. That there are logical fallacies within the structure. And at the same time, in terms of something that I think that we typically are consistent about with Dark Ozarks, and can be, because we are willing to just continually delve into these issues in weird and nuanced ways, is that just because the horse shied away from the grave, and that's really silly that would mean that it was a vampire, while it doesn't necessarily mean that the corpse was a vampire, certainly from a very traditional shifter lore, et cetera, doesn't mean that some of these things don't exist.
True. Very true. And I do think that, and I agree with you. I think there is an analogy between, or a parallel between, the reaction to the Feeney trial and this case in Ohio, that the non-occult average people reacted in such a way that ended up in basically a form of communal hysteria.
Yeah. Yes. And you do see that. And communal hysteria can occur at any time that there's great anxiety within the society, however large or small that society may be. It doesn't have to be in response to the occult, although it certainly is quite obvious when it is.
Mm-hmm. And in the process, these kind of cases that basically either the crime itself or the reaction to it in the community is almost a acting out, or as you said earlier, a cosplay of legend and lore.
Yes.
Without saying it.
And certainly the desire to be initiated into the occult in some way is surprisingly powerful, because you're dealing with hidden knowledge. You're dealing with the certainly the outside allure of knowing things that other people can't know,
Mm-hmm.
which I think makes it particularly alluring to slightly subversive to more subversive adolescence as a beginning.
Agreed.
And for obvious reasons. I mean, I don't think that there's anything too surprising about that. But something that the article in question noted is that many times things that get mistaken for ritualistic occult practices are essentially very hardcore cosplay of what is believed to be a reasonable facsimile of a ritual occult practice.
Which, and the reason that it's a facsimile is often what has been portrayed in pop culture.
Yes, and so it's, as the article noted, maybe the ritualistic circle was made, maybe an animal was abused, maybe something unpleasant did take place, but it was mirroring a folkloric belief, not that it was an actual religious ritual.
Right, and I do think that happens, and may well be a big component of activity that happens in the Springfield tunnels, as well as other instances, but also certainly I think even as in seemingly innocuous situations as going out to witches' graves and so forth.
Agreed. And there's some really compelling psychological reasons that I don't think rise to the level of spirituality or spiritual reasons. It is in many cases we're talking in some, I think it's fair to say, a superficial level of derisive counterculture. And for people who are like, what does that look like? Well, the simple act of spray painting 666 or an inverted pentagram on a bridge piling
For shock value.
but entirely for shock value, and the fact that the imagery is being derived from pop culture, and what you see then is it typically has its desired effect. Again, I think a fair argument could be made that, sorry to the kids doing this, but you're still within the unocculted peasantry.
Yeah, because you don't have that knowledge. You really don't have that knowledge. You're just faking it.
And you are simply trying to shock your equally unocculted peasant community.
Mm-hmm.
And the most rewarding aspect of that is when they respond predictably and are horrified.
Yes.
And that comparatively very shallow machination that cycles through a lot.
It does. And, so these kind of things, I think they come up from time to time, but it's just an illustration that it's the same mechanisms that have been at play for hundreds or thousands of years with this lore.
Yes. Yes, it has. And it's and at the same time, and I find this just to be a particularly intriguing aspect, is are there genuine occult practices going on? Are there long-standing essentially traditionalist pagan practices that have survived the common era? The logic says that in Europe, we, during the Renaissance, during the mass immigration and resettlement in the New World, we see many religious groups fleeing Europe for religious freedom because of the United States' overall structure. Most of those Christian groups, typically heretical Protestant sects, Anabaptists and Huguenots and such, when they got here and did have religious freedom, they were able to set up churches and develop denominations and write their church histories, and it was all out in the open. But the individuals, and we know the mass witch burnings that took place in continental Europe, there were many people of many different non-Christian belief structures who were also fleeing. But when they got to America, they couldn't be out in the open any more than they could in Europe. And
no, they'd be persecuted.
Yes, and so the persecution would have continued unless they were to practice underground, figuratively, basically, and that creates the intimation of an entire compendium of American history that's never been recorded, and could possibly, certainly, anything is underground in that aspect has the propensity in the modern era to be at risk of dying off, much like we've seen traditional folk beliefs in the Ozarks begin dying off in the 1930s and 1940s in the face of modernism. But it still begs the question, do those things continue? Are there rituals? Are there, quote unquote, occult in the correct application, i.e., hidden knowledge being practiced? I think the answer is yes, there are. Those things do happen. I
do too. I think that if you look at the fact that we know those traditions and practices continued for hundreds or thousands of years, despite lots of efforts to stamp them out. In many ways more persistent and arbitrary ways of trying to stamp them out than has happened in the last 200 or 300 years, that it is very likely that some have survived and passed that down. But again, in that tradition of you don't always advertise it, and so if you aren't looking for it, you're sure not going to find it. And even if you're looking for it, you may or may not find it unless someone wants you to. Which sounds like a cop-out, but I mean, to be honest, it really is true. So I agree. I think it has survived. maybe not as prevalent as 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, but in places with certain families, etc., yes, I think it probably has.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Which realistically might be a difficult and introspective point to conclude.
I agree. Lots of to think about there, but vampires do seem to be alive and well in the Ozarks.
Yes.
And on that thought, don't forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping to bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
On the next episode, we're going to be discussing how German folklore lives on in the Ozarks. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or about any other podcast platform. Thank you, everyone. Remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.